Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. The Minister of Higher Education and Training, Dr. Naledi Pandor, has approved the appointment of a task team to advise on sexual harassment and gender-based violence at public universities. Lisa Verton is a research associate at Wits University and part of the 9-member team. She joins me now. Good evening. Thanks very much for your time. From what you've been told, what is it exactly that you will be doing?
We'll be assisting the Minister with the implementation of the framework for addressing gender-based violence in the post-school education and training sector. So the framework was gazetted at the beginning of May, and it's out for public comment. So by the early June, comments should have been returned, and that it will then come into force, and we will start to advise the Minister on what needs to be done to ensure that it's made a living document and not just another piece of paper.
Well, I mean, among the provisions of this framework is, and I quote, everyone has the right to live, study and work freely and safely in these institutions without any fear of sexual or gender-based intimidation, harassment, abuse, rape, and other forms of sexual or gender-based harm. Now, this is something everyone ought to know.
Exactly.
But, of course, we know that these things do happen. Just from the work you've been doing in this area, just how widespread is the problem?
You know, I think that's one of the challenges in working in a university context. We have statistics for the problem in South Africa broadly, but we have almost no information about what's going on in the university sector. So we hear about a couple of universities, typically Wits or UCT or Rhodes or UKZN. But as to what's happening in Walter Sisulu University or Mangosuthu or Durban University of Technology, we have absolutely no idea. So I think one of our first challenges will be to start getting some kind of a picture, because that's going to be very important to understanding where do we need to focus our attention, do different universities have different problems, and is what we're doing actually having any effect?
What's interesting for me is that institutions of higher learning should take it upon themselves to actually do research, and especially within their own environment. Why is there no focus on this, or is there? I mean, why is it that problems, you know, that have everything to do with those institutions can't be so quickly researched? And
a lot of it, I think, has got to do with universities and their concern about their reputations. So no university wants to stand up and say, at our university, 30% of female students report having been sexually harassed. Because obviously, what parent is going to want to send their child there? So I think there's a tendency to want to look the other way and to try and sweep things under the carpet. I think also, for very odd reasons, universities have really lagged behind even the business sector. We had a code of good practice on sexual harassment through the LRA by the early 2000s. Here we are in 2017, and we're only getting our first framework compelling universities to take some kind of action. So for some reason, despite, as you say, they're the seat of learning, where our future leaders, our professional class are coming from, it's been a problem that's just been allowed to steadily and quietly do nothing about it. And in fact, if one looks historically, you can actually find some of the first protests on universities around sexual harassment dating back to 1984. So it's taken us 35 years to actually get to this point where all universities are now compelled to do something about the problem and not just the odd handful here and there.
But I mean, also one thing, I mean, the university students are generally very active and, you know, and with the culture that our new constitution and everything that goes with it has been encouraging, one would have thought that there would have, I mean, by now, have been a great deal, like a big movement that sort of pushes these universities to do what you say they don't want to do because of reputational and other concerns.
You know, it's been a very difficult problem in that students are a transient population. So they stay for 3-4 years, maybe 6 years to finish their degree, and then they move on. So you might get a particularly activist group who force the university to do something, but when they leave, it all falls apart. And I think what's often happened is it's not been embedded with staff, because staff also have difficulties. Those tend not to become the focus of public attention. So I think what's important about this is that it tries to embed it within the actual institutions now. So part of the framework is also ordering, in fact, universities to submit annual reports onto how many cases they've dealt with each year, what kind of disciplinary outcomes have there been, what steps have they taken to educate their staff and their students, and what they're doing in order to create an enabling environment. So that's been a bit of a first. And I think it's important as well that in some ways it's also been the department catching up. Because if you look at their first white paper issued in 1997, they were identifying the problem then, but again also didn't do something about it. So we've had a dual problem in that universities, because they're autonomous, it's been left up to them to decide whether or not they've been able to do anything. But you've also had the department perhaps not stepping in as strongly as it needed to have in the past. So I hope that with this new framework, that situation is going to change. We're not going to have to see protests, everyone runs around, does something, then nothing for a few years. Then another protest, everyone runs around, then nothing for a few years.
Off the top of your head, as Elizabeth, and when you meet with your other members of the panel, things that you think you'll be putting on the table for all of you to consider? The
resourcing of this. Because if you need to have specialised staff who've been trained. Ideally, you ought to have an office. But I think many universities in South Africa are in a very difficult position. They're not, as we saw from the fees protests, they simply don't have enough money to be able to do all the things that they do. And there's tremendous unevenness amongst universities. So I think it would be very important for us to look not just at the elite universities that have been historically white, but to also look at those universities that have sat in the former Bantustans, for example, who really have struggled, where 95% of their students are on NSFAS, for example. They will have very few resources to be able to do anything about this. So I think what I would like to see us doing is talking about how do we ensure that we're not just looking at those universities which have some resources, and even then it won't be enough, but that we also bring in those who've historically been left out and haven't been part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. Thanks very much for coming through. Lisa Vetson, a member of the ministerial task team that will be advising on sexual harassment and gender-based violence at public universities.